Hi everybody, today I'm taking another look at Axis and Allies 1981 by Nova Games. It's the very first version of A&A that came out a few years before Milton Bradley's mass-marketed edition, the one that everyone is familiar with today. The Nova box looks like this. These copies are extremely rare now and ridiculously expensive, even prohibitively so. It's no wonder why nobody seems to talk about the original setup anymore. Why bother now? Well, if you know me, you know that I'll play anything, and I find the workarounds. Nothing is too obscure, and nothing is ever really off the table. So with this video, I hope to revive some interest in this purest form of Axis and Allies. So let's analyze how this great game was originally intended to be played before Milton Bradley ruined it. I'm just kidding. They didn't ruin it. They streamlined the rules and gave it a facelift that sent it into orbit. And yet, I will say this, in the process of streamlining the game, MB cut out certain nuances, clever ideas, and details that I wish would have been developed further instead of just being dropped entirely. So let's highlight the differences between Nova and MB. And after I list them off, I want to categorize these details into three distinct tiers of significance that describe the degrees to which they affect actual gameplay. So there will be a highly significant group of features, a fairly significant group of differences, and then a host of relatively minor details that don't impact the play too much. At the end, I will give you my final opinion on this original design as it compares to the version everyone knows today. Okay, now for the quick account. Territories and sea zones, there's more of them in the Nova world. The setup is significantly different. In certain instances, it's even eye-popping. Units are limited by type. You can only deploy set numbers of each of them. Neutral country rules are more detailed. Attack and defense values on a couple of units are different. Submarines are handled differently. Movement rules are not the same. On land, movement takes place after attacking, so there's no blitzing into combat, for example. There are minor differences with respect to loading transport and landing bombers. Amphibious landings are different. Technological advances are slightly different. And the game comes with good optional rules that cover country-specific special abilities. And finally, the original game only had cardboard markers instead of plastic minis. In general, I'd say there are more differences with the Nova setup than most people might expect or remember. Okay, so before we head to the table, I should let you know, in case you're wondering, no, I didn't overpay for a used copy on the secondary market. Here was my workaround. So because Nova is long gone as a game company, I just PDF the rules after a simple internet search along with the setup cards and the map in sections off different sites. I matched the pieces together as a print and play project. It was the same technique I used to make my Xeno World at War map years ago, and you can check out a video I made on that game if you like. However, I actually don't recommend doing the same thing for the Nova map in this case for a couple of reasons. Simply put, it became a giant pain in the butt to do it, and there's not a lot of great quality partial scans out there that match up well, so overall it wasn't really worth it. Furthermore, Nova used an off-putting clownish color palette and a more cumbersome 100x currency system across the board. So it's more complicated than MB's map, but it's not up to modern standards in graphic design. So what I eventually did was junk the original map altogether and shell out some money for a larger, better Nova configuration reimagined to MB standards. And these maps may be found on eBay, and I just love the new look. So it was worth it to me to spend some money here. Then I just used a standard set of MB A&A minis on the board because I didn't want to print out all the chit and counter scans and then have to cut them all out individually and everything. And so the final product just looks like this. But how does it play? I think it's a good version. Different though. I rank the following as the most significant differences when compared to MB's game. The map layout, the starting setups, and unit limitations. I feel these features impact the gameplay the most. All of these points really dovetail nicely with one another too. So with an eye towards Russia, let's look at these most important factors. This setup adds Byelorussia to the Caucasus and moves Karelia's factory south into Kazakh SSR. Karelia is only worth 2 IPCs. So on the Eastern Front, Karelia is no longer the single most important territory in the entire game. Rather, it's the two spaces directly west of Russia where the war is ultimately going to be decided. So the East Front feels more accurate the way it plays out. In the Far East, the USSR feels more capable. It could smash into Manchuria on the first turn more powerfully than it can in MB's setup. So although in general the USSR feels more durable to start, even with just one more territory in the game, and with its IPCs spread more thinly, it's involved in two separate all-out wars right from the start. It's also worth mentioning that Russia doesn't begin with any bombers in this game, nor with ships of any kind. Lastly, the Russian player can't build infantry on the first turn because they start maxed out at 20, and no power can have more than 20 infantry on the board, ever. The max number of tanks is 15, by the way. Also, nobody can have more than 10 fighters, 8 transports, 6 bombers, 6 anti-aircraft guns, 5 submarines, 4 battleships, or 4 factories. Thus, Nova gives you more to think about every purchase phase, unlike in MB's game. Moving on to Germany, we see significant map differences as well. We have huge issues in Africa and changes in both Europe and the Middle East. First thing you notice are pro-Axis neutrals. Spain and Sweden both give Germany money even though they are technically neutral. And that means no power can enter the neutrals unless they pay 3 IPCs at the start of their turn to do so. Once neutrality status is violated, it is gone for the rest of the game, so any other power can then counterattack into the area for free. And I think these are a nice touch. They add layers to Germany's defensive network. Germany also gets little enclaves in Syria and in Eastern Africa. However, Africa is completely constricted by a chain of valueless neutrals, and this makes the African theater way harder for Germany. They don't get to conquer the entire continent like they do in the MB version. So once again, there's a more realistic feel to the gameplay in this area of the board. As far as the setup goes, the Germans in this game start basically maxed out in infantry and tanks. They have less planes though, and their surface fleet is also smaller. They must rely on submarines to impede the flow of reinforcements from North America across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. Overall, it's a clever setup. Great Britain in this game has a way more potent surface fleet to start. It has 4 battleships spread across the entire board, compared to the single German-Italian surface fleet that starts in the Mediterranean. In this game, the UK feels more spread out, far-flung, and diffuse in power, although the same may also be said for Japan and the USA. So why is this the case? Well, if you look at the sea zones, there are more of them in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. In the Pacific, they devolve into a chaotic mess of irregular shapes, so you have to at least acknowledge how well MB cleaned up this aspect of the original design. So the colonial possessions are indeed more far-flung. Even crossing the Atlantic with loaded transports takes more than one turn, but more on that later. Additionally, India is only worth 2 IPCs, but the British do have Persia and Iraq as significant neutral allies in the Middle East, even though both of them are difficult for the West to get to. So yeah, in battleships, the UK reigns supreme, and that's about it for the good news. To start the war, the English feel fairly weak otherwise, and really need to figure out how they're going to deal with the German submarine threat before they can ever think about getting back onto the continent in a meaningful way. They also have to find a way to protect their far eastern holdings from Japan. Their battleships alone are not enough to do this. So the next side we have to consider is Japan. In the Nova version, Japan faces a terrible dilemma at the outset, and I'm not saying Japan is a pushover or puny overall. I'm just saying that no less than 50% of its entire military potential is widely dispersed throughout the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, and yet it's faced with a dire emergency close to home in Manchuria right out of the gate. And unfortunately, more than half of Japan's infantry will not be available for the Kwangtung army unless it dismantles and redeploys its garrisons on the little island groups that dot the Pacific Ocean. And this is not a minor operation. So it can try to fight on the continent overweight with aircraft and tanks. However, any power that is under strength and manpower fighting an all-out war on land is just bound to take disastrous losses in the long run. And also notice Burma is broken up into 3 separate spaces, with Siam and Indochina added, all thinly fortified, by the way. Now, the Japanese do start with the best navy, with 2 aircraft carrier groups and 2 battleships. But the question is, what to do with the IJN? Does Japan set up an attack against the Americans? After all, Japan at the start is under no dire immediate threat from the USA, and it won't be for several turns, but it will be eventually. And the IPCs Japan needs to secure most of all to be bigger, stronger, and more durable are on land in the opposite direction. So what do? Still haven't figured out what the best opening strategy for Japan might be. It's not obvious in the Nova game as far as I can tell. Lastly, the USA, it's more peripheral in this game, literally. The way Nova handles China means the USA has no military strength to start in the old world that can stand against Japanese attacks. China is a pro-American neutral divided into 3 territories. If Japan wants to take it all, it would cost 9 IPCs for a 3 income boost per turn. So Japan would have to hold the whole or even parts of China for multiple turns before it sees any profit. So an empty China on the surface may seem weird and too easy for Japan, but the way things are strategically balanced in this region, it's just not the case. USA is perhaps out of the equation actively, but remember, Japan is already fighting tooth and nail over Manchuria. If they move into China, it will cost them money, and the Russians can easily take the western third of the country in greater force as a counter. So to partially make up for China, the USA gets Saudi Arabia and Mexico as pro-American neutrals. They also start with Trump's dream parlay, Venezuela and Greenland. Isn't that interesting? Isn't this game smart, though? It's like Xeno's World at War this way. You just read the rules and get the feeling these guys really knew their history. They really knew what they were doing. Anyway, Brazil is also deleted. The Aleutians are a separate space. The Americans don't start with a lot, but they do have the strongest economy, and they have some units that they can use immediately, already in Great Britain and in New Zealand, of all places. So America, I see as more of a challenge to get going in this setup. Now for the second tier, or fairly significant differences in the Nova design. We'll start with some combat rules. As mentioned before, there's no land movement prior to land combat, so you can fly planes into where you're attacking as support, subject them to AA guns. But the infantry and tanks attack from across borders, only then move in after the attack phase is resolved. It works. It makes for a slower pace, however, more plotting, perhaps more a cerebral game overall, I suppose. I honestly don't think it makes that much of a difference in practice. You get used to it. Submarines are different. They have their own activation phase before regular sea movement and combat. They behave like portable AA guns, but against ships in sea zones. They can move up to 2 spaces, even through or into enemy-occupied waters, and then you just leave them. It's when your opponent tries to use their surface ships that you get to fire a first round sneak attack with subs. This happens if an enemy starts a move in the same zone as one of your subs, or if an enemy moves through a zone with one of your subs, or if a transport loads a unit in a sea zone that has a sub in it, because that also counts as a move. So the English channel can be affected by this as well. But I'll give you an example of how this would work in another theater of operation. Let's say on Japan's turn, a Japanese submarine moves into the Hawaii sea zone that has an American aircraft carrier with 2 fighters on it and a US sub. So let's say on USA's turn, the American side tries to move the loaded carrier out of Hawaii. Before the American move, the Japanese submarine gets a fire. If it rolls a 1 or a 2 on a 1d6, the carrier goes down with both planes. That's the rule. The US sub can't be used as cannon fodder because submarines move in an entirely separate phase before surface ships, and subs only fire against surface ships. If the Japanese sub missed, then the aircraft carrier would return fire with both planes for 1 round. If everything missed, then the US aircraft carrier would just continue along its merry way, and the Japanese submarine would remain in place. So what does this all mean? It means submarines can't fight other submarines, and without destroyers in the game, it also means that, let's say if the Germans have all 5 submarine units active, for example, the Allies better have 8 transports available, with some being empty chump blockers. Otherwise, they'll be taking costly battleship, loaded transport, or loaded aircraft carrier losses. So it's all very expensive and more tricky to deal with submarines in this version of Axis and Allies. It's kind of neat to see submarines linger on the board, actually working to block sea zones and shipping lanes. I wouldn't say it's a worse way to play. Once again, it's just moderately different. AA guns are in this category as well. They're everywhere in this game. Why? Because they hit on a 1 to 3 on a 1d6 roll, but they do only roll once, thankfully. This means in practice, you can't really risk attacking any space with a single aircraft, especially if it has an AA gun in it. It's just too risky. It makes fighters even more defensive overall, in my opinion. And you don't want to strategically bomb over AA guns either with a single bomber ever. 1 to 3 on a single roll. It's very interesting. Amphibious landings are slightly different here as well. There are no shore bombardments in this game. Furthermore, during the first round of combat, everything that is attacking off a landing craft only hits on a 1 result. On subsequent rounds, everything goes back to normal. So it's thematic. Also, as I said before, loading a transport ship eats up one of the ship's movement points, so landing operations in general take more time to pull off in this game. Another odd rule is that you can land bombers on aircraft carriers, but if you do it, it drops the defensive value of the bomber to 0. Speaking of attack and defense values, we will wind up this mid-tier of rules differences by mentioning that in Nova's game, aircraft carriers themselves only defend with a 1 result. So it's important they always have at least 1 fighter on them. Finally, we'll look at the last category of differences that include some rules that are either more superficial in nature or simply ones that do not come into play very often during the course of normal gameplay. I put the technology advancements into this category because players don't always use them. 2 of them are different. There's no industrial technology in this game. Instead, the 5 result is called fifth column and is meant to represent an advantage in political connivery. If you get this power, you don't have to pay 3 IPCs if ever you violate a country's neutrality. In this version of ANA, it's something that could actually make a difference. Bigger deal, however, is the 6 result on the technology advancement chart. It's not just heavy bombers, it is indeed the A-bomb. If you develop it, you could pay 10 IPCs at the start of your turn to deploy one, match it up with the bomber. Mind you, you can only ever have 1 A-bomb at the board at any given time. It's a single-use weapon, obviously. And then during your turn, you can try to strategically bomb an industrial site. If you survive any AA defenses, the bomb detonates and eliminates everything in the territory, factory, the AA gun, and all the other units. Problem is, AA guns hit on 1 to 3. And since you can only use 1 A-bomb at a time, and it has to be a single bomber raid, there's only a 50% chance the raid will be successful. That is, unless you also have the jet power technology. And the rules say that jet-powered atomic bombers always get through. So that's a super interesting built-in destabilizing mechanism of the Nova edition that ultimately got lost. Potentially, every turn, multiple powers could be nuking each other with atomic bombers until there's virtually nothing left to effectively wage war. I haven't seen that actually happen in a game yet, but it's a possibility. And lastly, the Nova edition includes optional rules for country-specific special abilities, and I always play with these. So the Russians have the ability to move their factories. The Germans can designate one of their tank units as an elite each turn. I just painted one of my gray tanks black, and this single armor unit hits on a 4 and defends on a 5. The UK gets a defensive bonus on all infantry that defend Great Britain. They hit on a 3. Japan can designate 1 fighter unit per turn as a kamikaze, and these get a range bonus and a +1 attack bonus. But at the end of the attack round, they are removed. And finally, the USA can designate 1 group of infantry per amphibious attack as marine units. So for example, 1 transport full of 2 infantry units can attack with a 2 instead of a 1. These are all interesting and thematic, and in practice I found they work well and are fun to use, although I don't think they impact the gameplay too heavily. Maybe the German elite unit, if you know how to use it, works particularly well as Africa Corps. There are even more superficial differences as well. Among them, I should point out an issue for some people. Nova did use the swastika on the German cardboard tokens, and that's an automatic trigger or warning for modern audiences these days. Okay, so overall, what's the verdict? What do we have here? Is Nova Games ultimately something completely obsolete, or is it something worth revisiting? I say, if you're willing to put a little effort into making it all happen, building it out, setting it up. In the end, you won't be disappointed. No way. It has some great features. The neutral power rules are better. In MB, the neutrals are nothing. They're boring. The layout of the Nova map is better overall, I think. Africa feels more realistic, for example. The submarine rules, AA gun rules, and other quirky differences are fine. They do make the game a bit slower to play, especially the unit restriction feature, since all that has to be monitored by players every turn. And all that being said, I do understand why MB made the changes that they did. If you're concerned about global sales, maybe you would wonder how many copies of the game you're going to sell in Sweden if you portray them in-game as Nazi sympathizers. Or how are atomic bomb rules going to go over in Japan or German elite units in the European market? Remember, MB is a family game company, and really, how can you argue with the MB treatment considering how popular the game ultimately became under their banner? Nevertheless, I still argue the Nova original is worth a try if your MB set has gone stale with time. You have to imagine the Nova game as a midway point, a compromise between the MB version and Xenogame's World at War. Nova's a little more complicated than MB. Eventually, Xeno just took some of Nova's extra details and ran with them, I think. Double the country's specific powers, even more rules for neutrals, etc., etc. And that became World at War. Ultimately, though, I think the Nova rule set still has value in the following way. I think some of its lost features may be resurrected and retooled for another Gold Sack special, Milton Bradley Axis and Allies Top 10 Mods video Part 2. I'll look into it. I'll see what I could come up with. Is it possible to cherry pick some of Nova's better ideas and then reapply them to your old ANA base game? We'll see. In the meantime, thanks for watching and stay tuned for more content coming soon.